John Steenhof, as Managing Director of the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is that religious freedom legal clinic that helps Christians who get in trouble with the law for living out their faith, I thought it would be really worthwhile getting us on camera together to talk about today's decision of the High Court. Kathy, as we know, a pro-life mother of 13 involved in a tremendous sidewalk counselling ministry that's seen more than 300 babies born alive and their mothers given all manner of support and help in their hour of need. And of course, Graham Preston, just a real warrior for this cause.
Well, we've got a decision that's come down from the High Court today for both Clubb and Preston. 189 pages, 7 justices, 5 judgments. So it deals with both Victorian and Tasmanian laws and is quite a complex judgment. But what it boils down to is whether they can prevent communication in relation to abortion in Victoria and Tasmania in what are called safe access zones. Both Tasmania and Victoria have legislation that prohibits communication in Victoria or protest in Tasmania within 150 metres of the perimeter of an abortion clinic. That's about 70,000 square metres, or roughly 3 city blocks that are blanketed by this ban. If their case had been successful, Kathy Clubb's conviction would have been overturned, which would have been a great result for her and for Mr. Preston. So what they were trying to argue was that these laws place a burden on their freedom of speech and so are invalid.
Well, can we just stop for a second? What did they actually do? So we've got the 150 metre perimeter or zone in which they're not allowed to communicate on the subject of abortion, or for Mr. Preston protest on the subject of abortion. I understand, Mr. Preston did have a sign, a protest sign, but Kathy's conduct wasn't the same, was it? It was different.
No, the facts in the two cases are slightly different and they get slightly different consideration by the judges, whereas Mr. Preston had 2 signs, and it was widely accepted that what he was engaged in was political communication.
Right.
Kathy, in fact, had no sign. She was definitely in the 150 metre zone, but she walked up to and spoke to 2 people walking into an abortion clinic. She attempted to give to them a pamphlet, and they declined.
That's because she was much more involved in a counselling ministry sort of program, I suppose. I mean, we can assume, well, I'm going to assume anyway, that, because of the years of work she had done in that kind of ministry, to say to people, hey, alternatives are available. If you need help, come and talk to me. So we've got a sidewalk counselling soft approach, and we've also got the guy with the 2 signs, standing near a clinic saying this is wrong.
Correct. Right. And in Kathy's case, there was, in both cases, there was no evidence of any harassment or cajoling or anyone being unnecessarily harassed in that instance.
And they were criminally convicted, both of them, at the magistrates' courts in Melbourne and Hobart, respectively.
Correct. The threshold of the law is incredibly low for a criminal conviction.
Okay, and how low is it?
Well, in the case of Victoria, it is mere communication. And in the case of Tasmania, it is protest, which can include silent protest.
Okay. And so what's the rationale that the court adopted to land at the decision that, yeah, those criminal convictions are completely appropriate, that these laws that set in place a framework that make that conduct criminal are completely appropriate? Why? What was their thinking?
Well, what they do is they apply a balancing act. And as you can imagine, that balancing act is complex. It took 189 pages, but it's effectively balancing between the burden that's imposed on the freedom of Kathy and on the freedom of Mr. Preston, as opposed to the legitimacy and the purpose of the law that places the burden. So the court looks at both of those, and it has some frameworks of analysis for that. And at the end, the High Court decided that the laws were valid, that their purpose was sufficient to override whatever burden they placed on Kathy's rights and on Mr. Preston's rights. And so they failed. The law's been upheld.
Yep.
And these provisions are upheld. Now, it's not the end of the story. That while their convictions are upheld for now, and they failed on these grounds of appeal, there are still grounds of appeal that are left to be heard in their relevant jurisdictions. So the story for them is not over.
Okay.
And what we've established now is simply that these provisions are valid at law. The question now is, were the magistrates at first instance right to convict Kathy and to convict Mr. Preston on those provisions? We know now that abortion and talking about abortion is a political issue, but not all speech about abortion was found to be political.
Right.
So it needs to be furthering political ends. So there's some uncertainty for people there.
I see.
The other thing, and it's something that I find a little bit confronting, is this. The majority of the judges and the justices in the High Court clearly understood that the effect of this law was harsh. You're criminalising the conduct of people and a very low threshold of conduct.
And it is criminal conduct. I mean,
That's
usually
right.
we apply criminality to higher threshold stuff.
Correct.
More serious stuff. Yep.
That's right.
Gotcha.
They also said that it's broad. There is a low threshold for offending these laws. So it's harsh, it's broad, and a minority said it's clearly targeted at the pro-life voice. It's going to affect the pro-life voice much more than it's ever going to affect anyone who's pro-abortion. They're not standing in exclusion zones. They're not the ones who are protesting. So it's harsh, it's broad and easy to offend, it's targeted. And yet, despite all that, they said it's in the interests of the law, it's in the interests to uphold these provisions and allow these safe access zones.
So what was the overwhelming thing that meant that the harshness, the breadth of it, the low, all those things became, if you like, not enough to make the law invalid? What was the competing consideration? What was the thing that was so great, the cause that was being championed, that was considered more important?
If you get to the nub of it, the nub is that the judges relied on what they said was the core human right of human dignity. The idea being that a woman who is going to obtain an abortion, her human dignity is at risk, and this law is targeted at protecting her human dignity, her right to privacy, her right not to be accosted by someone who wants to project unwanted political speech at her.
It strikes me that there's someone else's human dignity at risk if a woman is approaching an abortion clinic as well. What about the child?
Well, look, the child doesn't come into it all, and this highlights another problem that's evident in this decision, is that there's no provision, there's no there's no credence given to the fact that there's another life involved.
They just
that
don't even acknowledge it.
Dignity of a child's life. The language that is used is from one side of the debate, and it's from the side of the debate that's had the most of the coverage and has been trying to form the narrative on this throughout the last 20, 30, 40 years. So they talk about a woman's private rights, that this is a medical matter, that this is a reproductive health decision.
I see. So they use all of that euphemistic language that we see that the pro-choice, the pro-abortion crowd using all the time to mask the realities that this is a child, this is an act of killing, and those sorts of things. They use that, I guess, glossier, better for PR style language.
Correct. And the difficulty there is that supposedly the court is neutrally entering into a balancing exercise. Now, I'm not trying to impugn the impartiality of the court, but it's impossible to make one of these decisions without picking a language, and that language is not neutral. And the court here clearly picked the language of abortion being a medical procedure, a private health issue for a woman.
Right.
And so that is going to affect how you apply your balancing test.
Right. Of course, one of the real practical outcomes of this is that the unbelievable ministry of a group called the Helpers, of which Kathy was a part, that saved all those lives, that helped all those women, is effectively over. Because in order to be effective, you've got to be within 150, without 70,000 square metres, or what was the figure that you said, around the clinic. You've got to be there. Otherwise, it isn't going to work and people aren't going to get the help they need. So that's over.
Correct. The courts were quite comfortable that you could adequately communicate on abortion 151 metres away from an abortion clinic. There was only one judge who discussed the idea that it's quite a long way and that if it was longer, it might be a law which would need to be struck down. So if it was 200 metres, there was only one judge who was willing to say, we're looking at the tolerable limits
I see.
of a safe zone.
Yep. So look, this case, it seems to me, is a bit of a blow for freedom of speech. It exposes, as we said, the weakness of freedom of speech protections here. A bit of a blow for the pro-life cause and some really legitimate efforts in that regard. Should we be pessimistic, John?
Well, I think, Martyn, that one should never be pessimistic. We serve a great God. We've read the book and we've seen the last chapter and we know who wins.
Sure.
So that is always a cause for optimism.
Sure.
We can be pessimistic about people. We can be pessimistic about authorities and those in courts who are supposed to uphold what is good, what is moral, what is best for society. And we can be disappointed with them. But I think we also need to pray for them. We also need to mobilise so that our language is front and centre and getting a hearing within society, within the cultural narrative, as hard as that may be. We need to talk about the importance of life. We need to keep that front and centre. And we need to look at the avenues we can work in to achieve change. So I think optimism is the only course, and it's always the course. We serve a great God. He does great things.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, John, for
Thanks,
your insights.
Martyn.
Cheers.